COVID-19 has served to highlight the critical nature of many infrastructure systems and services, both for maintaining economic and social activity and enabling responses to unexpected threats and challenges. In the upcoming keynote address, Junaid Kamal Ahmad, India Country Director, South Asia, World Bank, will highlight the trends and future outlook of infrastructure investment in post-pandemic world. Welcome, Mr. Ahmad.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure for me to join all of you in today's discussion about infrastructure. I have a few messages to share with you about infrastructure in the context of India. So let me tell you perhaps the storyline that I'd like to share with you and then take you through that storyline. The storyline is quite simple. I think we all recognize the importance of infrastructure in economic development. But coming out of COVID, we now recognize that infrastructure development has an added mission. And that added mission is to bring India back to its 7 to 8% growth rate. So it's not only that you need infrastructure on a day-to-day basis, but post-COVID, to catch up the lost ground, India must invest in infrastructure. But the question is, how should it invest in infrastructure? The traditional story has been, it's about a fiscal stimulus, how much money is put into infrastructure. What I'd like to talk about today is, yes, I agree that it is about the fiscal stimulus and how much money government is going to put into it. But the name of the game is not the amount necessarily of the fiscal input of government, but how much does that fiscal input leverage resources into infrastructure? Will $1, 1 rupee of government expenditure lead to 5, 6 times that amount in private investment, in mobilizing the capital markets? That's the name of the game in infrastructure today, leveraging of the fiscal side. That's the first message. Second message is, if you want to actually deliver on that leveraging, you need to do some rethinking, if you will, or a different approach to how to deliver infrastructure. The best way I can summarize it is to say, don't fix the pipes, fix the institutions that fix the pipes. So you can go into a city and say it needs more water and let's put in the pumps and let's put in the pipes for water. Or you can create a global class water company which will fix the pipes. But when you create a global class water company, it can go into the market and raise resources to invest in the system. So to leverage, you really need the ability to move towards what we call bankable infrastructure, not bankable projects, but bankable institutions. That is extremely important. And then my final message would be that to create these bankable institutions, if you will, there's a role that social protection needs to play, and there's a role that we need to relook at climate finance. So let me try and bring all of this together. But let's begin by reminding ourselves of some numbers. India has usually spent around 4 to 5% of GDP on infrastructure. This is public plus private. This was well below the levels required for the country, which was estimated at about 7 to 8% of GDP. Not surprisingly, in 2019, and I don't have the later figures, in 2019, India ranked low in terms of infrastructure quality and quantity at the 70th position out of 141 countries. So basically, it was falling behind, if you will, already in the amount of infrastructure expenditure it needed to do. 7 to 8% GDP needed, delivering about 4 to 5% instead. COVID, unfortunately, has led to an added burden. And in that added burden, not only are we seeing the need to deliver on that 7%, 8% GDP infrastructure expenditure, but you really need to spend more to catch up, if you will, on the COVID loss. Now, the COVID loss is something that I'd like to just remind all of us. COVID was a very different type of shock. It was a health shock. And a response to the health shock required governments around the world to actually slow down the economy. Why? The idea was to slow down the economy to stop the spread of the disease. But as it slowed down, government realized one needed to bridge communities, especially poor and vulnerable, during this slowdown. And so there was an investment in social protection. There was also an investment in stabilizing the economy, small and medium enterprise. But now that COVID is being more or less managed, I wouldn't say that we've won the war against COVID, but we're beginning to manage it. And in that management, India has had a historic achievement, which is its vaccination. 1 billion people already vaccinated. Right now, I think about 30%, if not more, fully vaccinated, and about 55, 59% one dose vaccination. Incredible, incredible story. But now for the future, it's going to be very important. It's going to be very important for government to use infrastructure to give a stimulus to take India back to that 7-8% growth rate that it had. Now, to get there, India usually would spend around $4 to $5 trillion over the next 25 years, US dollars. However, given the COVID shock, the amount to be spent has to be even more. Now, the power of infrastructure is very clear. Data from India, third-party analysis and historical data tells us that an increase in infrastructure spending by 1% of GDP can boost economic growth by 2% and generate up to 1.4 million jobs. So you can see the multiplier effect of infrastructure. So in a context where India needs to invest in infrastructure, in a context where it needs to increase its investment to overcome the loss in COVID, infrastructure is quite a powerful stimulus. We know that central government has launched a scheme for special assistance to states for capital expenditure as part of its Atmanirbhar Bharat package in September 2020. This is already the beginning of that expenditure boost, if you will, in infrastructure. We also know that overall in fiscal year 22 union budget, there's been a sharp 26% increase in capital expenditure. That's about US $76 billion. But even more important, government has announced the National Infrastructure Pipeline with a plan to spend about 1.4 trillion on infrastructure during 20 to 25, during this period. It was launched in 2020. What's also important is that government has created the National Monetization Pipeline, in addition to the National Infrastructure Pipeline. And the monetization potential of infrastructure is somewhere around $81 billion, which would be about 5, maybe 6% of total infrastructure investment in NIP. In addition, government is putting I think, around $2.5, $2.7 billion to set up and capitalize a development financial institution, a DFI, dedicated to infrastructure. So huge challenge in infrastructure, a need to really use infrastructure to give a stimulus to the economy in a context of emerging out of COVID, and the different programs and schemes of government are well on their way. All of this is absolutely important. Now let me turn to what I would like to put on the table, which is this expenditure by itself is not enough. And this expenditure is not what is going to give infrastructure stimulus. What we need is to use this public finance to actually leverage several folds resources from capital markets, from institutional finance into infrastructure. That's going to be the real game changer for India. Now, the question is, how can that be done? Well, I think the first thing we have to recognize is India is moving away from a public sector banking paradigm to a paradigm of finance which is, yes, public banks, but also commercialized private banks, as well as figuring out mechanisms to bring in the capital markets. So, for example, during the COVID shock, Government of India created credit lines for small and medium enterprises, but it also created a guarantee program, a first loss program, which allowed NBFCs to put in money into small and medium enterprise. That kind of a leveraging to bring in capital markets, to bring in NBFCs, is an example of what when I talk about leveraging. And this is extremely important because the share of private sector and infrastructure investment has been steadily declining from 37% in fiscal year 8 to 28% in fiscal year 13 to about 25% in fiscal year 19, and I suspect even less if we look at the numbers today. In the context of, let's say, Latin America and the Caribbean with the middle income economy, the public and private sector financing is typically 60 to 40%, right? 60% public, 40% private, if not 50-50. It's the leveraging that becomes very important. So the first element of that leveraging is to shift away from relying on public banks or banks to really be the source of money for infrastructure. Banks have, if you will, terms of a few months to maybe 5 years worth of tenure, when you need for infrastructure 15, if not 20 years of long-term money. So moving away from just public banks to actually beginning to figure out mechanisms of leveraging capital markets. So the instruments, the financial instruments, need to be about first loss, need to be about guarantees, risk management, so that capital markets can come in. That's extremely important. Government has mechanisms like the InvITs and few others. The DFI that government is now looking into, the DFI infrastructure, rather than being a traditional DFI, really needs to pivot, if you will, to becoming a leveraging DFI. That it becomes, if the best way for me to describe it is a credit enhancement institution. So yes, you can give direct lines of credit as the old DFIs, but right now the game is to really create a credit enhancement story, again, to leverage the capital markets. And by leveraging capital markets, I'm not only talking about if you will, the insurance funds or the pension funds within the country, but really go after insurance and pension funds across the world. Today, the global pension funds, global insurance funds have their eyes on India. They want to come in on India, but it is not going to come in through a public finance mechanism. It'll come in if that public finance mechanism leverages this capital markets. So shift away from public banks into mechanisms that are engineering, financial engineering for leveraging. First message. Second message, it's not enough to work on the financial market side, the supply of resources, of financial resources. You have to also work on the demand side. And let me give you concrete examples. If you look at India, India created, I think at least 2 decades ago, Power Grid. It created Concor. These are 2 public sector companies under public corporate laws, given operational independence with its own revenue sources to actually act as a company. And these companies, Power Grid, Concor, are able to go into the markets to borrow and fund themselves. Take a look at the world's largest water company, Sabesp in Brazil. It's a public sector company, but how does it finance itself? Because it is a corporate body, because it's a company in the way it operates, because it focuses on operations and maintenance. It has the autonomy to do so. It goes into global capital markets to actually finance itself. It's quite extraordinary. India today stands at I would say, a inflection point where in transport, in electricity, in all the infrastructure that it has, water, it has to move away from traditional public sector state-owned enterprises to actually real corporate bodies that run under, in effect, run under market principles, so it can go into the markets and draw in resources. I gave you the example of Concor, gave you the example of a power grid. You have in Delhi two distribution companies in electricity that follow exactly the same process. Remember that Delhi went through the reform where its electricity, in effect, public agency was split into two, and you had two public-private partnerships being created. If you look at Karnataka, Karnataka has three towns, Belgaum, Hubli Dharwad, where they've actually taken 20% of the households and put them under a corporate utility, and they're delivering 24/7 water. If you look at freight corridors, today freight corridors is being managed under a corporation, right? It's a corporate body, which is the Freight Corridor Corporation. Over time, this Freight Corridor Corporation, like the airports company, will be running railway tracks as if they were runways in which public and private rail companies can function. And what that will do is will take freight off the roads and put them on electrified railways. They will run more efficiently, and at the same time, climate change. You're taking away greenhouse gas emissions from road trucks carrying freight into electrified rail, which has huge impact on the greenhouse gas emissions. So already two ways of thinking about how one creates a leveraged infrastructure framework. One is move into financial systems that bring in capital markets. Two, begin to create company structures to deliver infrastructure. Again, water companies, electricity companies, transport, bus companies, rail companies, bring in public-private partnership in them, but enable them to have a revenue source, enable them to have operational independence so they can go into the market. Now, here comes the third part, that if you're going to make these shifts into bankable institutions so that they can go into capital markets to actually raise resources supported by first loss, credit enhancement mechanism of government, you have to deal with the fact that services are underpriced in India. You can no longer have free electricity. You can no longer have free water, right? You have to have transport costs that begin to reflect some levels of operations and maintenance cost recovery. Mind you, I'm not talking about a 100% tariff increase. I'm talking about a reasonable tariff increase over time so that these corporate structures, these companies have a revenue source that can be pledged to bring in the capital markets. But if you're going to do that, you need to protect the low-income households, right? And you need to ensure that this transition is smooth. For that, you need a social protection system of the 21st century. And India is already pivoting into that social protection system. How? It is beginning to provide direct cash transfers. India has one of the largest, if not the largest, direct cash benefit systems going into the hands of low-income, poor, vulnerable communities. Women, for example, single-headed women households received direct budget transfers into their bank accounts, especially during the COVID era. You have programs at the state level where Kisan, the agricultural farmers, are getting straight income support. If you can provide a social protection for farmers, for low-income communities, for vulnerable households, then you can create a separation between the safety nets and the pricing of infrastructure. Pricing of infrastructure should not be the mechanism by which you provide social protection. Social protection should be provided directly. And here, Government of India has made a significant shift, especially during the COVID era. India, traditionally known as a rural-based social protection, Manrega being being a very important one. India known for its food distribution system, which was very important during the COVID period. Now, India has begun to put in social protection for informal workers, for the urban workers, and importantly, it's allowing workers to carry their social protection entitlements across states, the portability of social protection. If you create that social protection layer, you can protect communities, you can protect farmers, and allow the pricing of electricity, water, transport to reflect real economic delivery. Why do you need to have that? Because you need those corporate bodies that I talked about to have a revenue source which they can pledge into the markets to bring in. So the leveraging in infrastructure requires, importantly, a strong social protection system, which is exactly what India has been investing in. And then the final point that I want to talk about is climate change. Climate change is, as you saw in COP26, we are at a period where infrastructure today must be built in a resilient way. Why? Because you have floods, you have earthquakes that are coming, and need to ensure that your infrastructure is resilient. The Prime Minister's Rural Roads Program is an incredible program because the structure with which the roads are being built are today very much resilient standards. Over the last few years, Government of India has completely changed the standards of rural roads, indeed roads across the country, into which now we have resilience being built in, right? So you have resilience as part of the climate change story. Second is shifting the mode of delivery of services. As I mentioned, move freight from roads onto rail and inland water. So investment in rail and investment in inland water, which is huge infrastructure investment, actually has tremendous impact on climate change because it reduces the greenhouse gas emission. As India improves its transport sector infrastructure and mode of service delivery, it will help solve the world's climate transition. Because when India makes these moves, it's at scale. It's not just simple. Third is we know that private finance today is searching for resilient and climate-friendly infrastructure. They will charge higher premium to those infrastructure that are not built with resilience. They'll charge lower premium where it's possible to see that infrastructure is built with climate in mind. So both from a market perspective, as well as from a government perspective, the financing of infrastructure becomes consistent with climate change. And then the final story of climate change in COP26 is the story of coal. Today, India has made a commitment to 500 gigawatts of renewable energy. It's a bold vision of the Honorable Prime Minister, and already over 100 gigawatts have been delivered. To give you an example, the World Bank worked with State Bank of India in 2019 and put in $500–600 million of resources, lines of credit for rooftop solar for the industrial sector. It was about maybe 500–600 megawatts of rooftop solar at that time. Today, it's 6,500, if not 7,000 gigawatts, 7,000 megawatts, which is about 6 gigawatts, 6 to 7 gigawatts of solar panel energy. This shift is accompanied by $650 million being translated into close to $5 billion leverage from the markets. Already, India is shifting its infrastructure of energy into being far more climate friendly. But there will be another very important story, which is as renewable energy comes in, the price of energy is falling. The Reva, which is Madhya Pradesh solar park, which World Bank invested about $20 million, but markets delivered $500 million to build Reva. It produces almost 60% of the energy needs of New Delhi's metro, underground metro, right? Who would have thought that Madhya Pradesh would be sending renewable energy to Delhi to to run its underground metro? It's an extraordinary story. But these shifts are making coal irrelevant in today's world. Coal will not be competitive. It is not competitive already in many parts of the world. Government is going to be putting in across the world transitions to make sure that workers, small and medium enterprise, land dedicated to coal, all of these have to be repurposed and shifted into alternate infrastructure. And unless the social protection and government financing of this transition is done, private money will not come in to fund the alternative infrastructure. So if you take the land that is for coal out of coal, it becomes hugely available for solar parks, for example. But there will be no investment in that unless government pays for that social protection and then leverages in the climate, leverages in the infrastructure. So ladies and gentlemen, India is at an inflection point in rethinking its paradigm on infrastructure. That rethinking of the paradigm on infrastructure is about public finance, yes, but it's about public finance that will leverage several folds private finance. That leveraging, however, will require India to rethink how to deliver services. It must go from the traditional public sector delivery of infrastructure services to one of building companies, public-private partnerships around management of infrastructure, such as in transport, such as in water, such as in electricity, so that infrastructure gets translated into infrastructure services. It's not enough to buy buses and putting them out into the cities of India. You've got to put the buses inside a bus company that knows how to convert those buses into efficient services. If that kind of a structure is created and those structures are able to have some level of cost of revenue from their services, that can be pledged into the markets to bring in capital finance. And here, government, instead of directly just financing, is creating different instruments, first loss, guarantees, InvITs, to actually attract finance into such companies. And underpinning it all is a social protection strategy that will protect the poor and the vulnerable and the worker as infrastructure gets changed. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not a simple story of change. This is not simply one that can be dealt with in a technocratic way. This requires political leadership, political decisions. It requires an agreement between citizens, service providers, and government. There is a whole process of change. This is how other countries have done that, whether it's in Australia or whether it's in Brazil. And India today is well on its way, as it has dealt with COVID, well on its way of rethinking infrastructure in today's world. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope the few words that I've shared with you will resonate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmad, for all the insights and useful information shared by you. It's time for our next session. Stay with us.